Hello everyone, this is Mary Towns, and for the next few minutes I'd like to share with you some information about the book I read called Great by Choice by Jim Collins and Morton Hansen. In 2002, the authors began to look back at some things that had happened. The government surplus that we'd had in the 70s and 80s had become deficits, and the government was now in a great deal of debt. The long-running bull market had crashed and was fluctuating, and life had changed for everyone as a result of the events of September 2001, and we all know about those. They wanted to know, why do some companies thrive in uncertainty, even chaos, and others do not? So in 2002, they decided to look back at some companies and see if they could compare the ones that had become great to the ones that have become not so great. The qualifications for making the final cut in this research, which was actually conducted between 2002 and 2011, was that the companies, which were public traded companies, had to have outperformed their industry index by at least 10 times, so they called them 10Xers. They had to sustain exceptional results for at least 15 years and possibly more. They must have achieved greatness during a turbulent time, and they had to have begun their rise as a young or a small business. Now, what they were focusing on was what they termed a dynastic era for each company that ended in 2002. Some of them went back to the 70s, some of them went back to the 80s. It'd kind of be like looking at the Bear Bryant years at the University of Alabama. For those of you that are from Alabama, you're very familiar with that. But the Bear Bryant years, there was no one like Bear Bryant. And the way his coaching style was, they could look at his coaching style, look at what he did, and compare his team to one that didn't do as well but had the same opportunities. And that's what this study is, basically looking at different companies. The final set of 10X cases were based on performance and environment. The companies, as you can see there, are Amgen, Biomet, Intel, Microsoft, Progressive Insurance, Southwest Airlines, and Stryker. You see also the years that they studied. Now, the ones I recognized were Intel, Microsoft, Progressive, and Southwest. If you've not read the book Nuts about the rise of Southwest Airlines, you need to read that. That is a very good book. But if you look at the third column, it tells you that $10,000 invested on December 31st, 1972 in these companies, each of these companies, and held until December 31st, 2002, that's a period of 30 years, your $10,000 investment would have ended up in the millions, and you can see there what they would have been. The last two columns are actually the company's performance relative to the market, and the last column is the company's performance relative to the industry. Now, the research on these companies were companies actually in the same industry. They had commonalities of being in the same industry, having the same or similar opportunities within that industry, and they began, in the study period they were in the same position as smaller startup companies. The comparisons were Amgen was Genentech, Biomet was Kirshner. You can see the others. The one that struck me actually was Microsoft and Apple being the other not so well done company. So you can see that Apple has actually changed. This was a pre-Steve Jobs era study. So Apple was being compared to Microsoft, which at the time almost had a monopoly on the industry. Now, the findings, the leaders of the 10X company, they shared certain core behaviors. The leaders had fanatic discipline, which really meant they were extremely consistent, that it had intense perseverance. They just kept on keeping on, as they say, and they were fiercely independent. They didn't follow the path of anybody else. They led their own path. Also, there was empirical creativity. They wanted direct observation. They wanted to experiment for themselves and test the waters for themselves and have direct engagement in what was going on. They didn't want to depend on somebody else's advice. So they didn't just go to a group of people and say, what do you think? You think we should do this? They actually looked at the evidence. The third characteristic or behavior was productive paranoia. Now, I know all this sounds very complicated, but what this simply means is that they stayed prepared. They were up on what the possible risk could be, and they did their best to minimize those risks and limit every possible risk they could. And they also watched and were extra sensitive to any changes that might affect them. Now, those companies shared characteristics and actions that they took. One particularly was the 20-mile march. It kind of goes along with the old thing, slow and steady wins the race. They kept on track. They kept committed to high performance, even when people were telling them that they needed to back off. They stayed their course, even in the difficult conditions. And often in the good conditions, they held back rather than maybe jumped into something a little too soon. The second one, the authors called this fire bullets, then cannonballs. Really, what this meant to me was that they were actually testing different markets and products and activities on a smaller scale to allow them to look at how well this was doing, to take time to study it without particularly investing a lot of resources in it. And that gave them the opportunity to discontinue products or activities or anything that in that particular market that would cause a problem. If what they were doing proved to be profitable, then the company could make a larger commitment. And that's what they call firing cannonballs, is to put more resources into it. Now, they also have another concept that's interesting called leading above the death line. Now, if you've ever studied any companies, you know there were certain activities that they might have done, some that failed, that just killed the company. This is what they're talking about is really part of the productive paranoia, and it's the point of no return. It's where there's usually not a recovery for the company. So these companies make sure they're always above that line. Another is what they call the SMAC recipe. It's specific, methodical, and consistent. It's defined as durable operating practices that create a replicable and consistent success formula. It's like maybe your operations manual at work. We've always had a standard procedures manual that we go by in different cases. So the comparison companies change their recipe more often than the 10Xers according to the results of the study. Now, all through this book, the authors used one particular real-life example to illustrate the differences in leadership and being prepared. And it was the Amundsen-Scott race for the South Pole in 1911. Amundsen had all his life prepared for what he wanted to do. He knew he wanted to be an adventurer, an explorer, and so he had prepared, even going to stay with the Eskimos to find out how to live, what they did to survive in the cold, how they survived using dogs and learning how to use the dog sleds, preparing extra and over and above what he needed to do. Where Scott actually did not do that. He used ponies, which were bad because they sweat and their hides developed sheets of ice, and he didn't have enough supplies. So Amundsen actually reached the South Pole sooner, and when Scott got there, he saw Amundsen's flag. Unfortunately, Scott and his team died. They froze to death, so they didn't make it back. But the whole point of this is that what they decided to do was they really wanted to determine if the old ways of doing things were kind of out of fashion. So many people say because the world's changing so fast, the company practices need to change with it. But Collins and Hansen concluded that the old rules still apply. The company survived in turbulent times by being consistent and methodical and using tried and true methods. Now, if you'll note, since this study was completed, some of the 10Xers have fallen from their positions, if you keep up with companies, while some of the comparison companies, we talked about Apple, for instance, have risen to greatness. I hope you'll take an opportunity to read this book. It was really interesting, and I found it to be quite a good read. So thank you for your time, and if you get a chance, read this book.